It keeps us humane. This is our standard. This is where you're not meeting it.
But there's a line leaders have to watch. There's a difference between supporting and rescuing.
The leader should help the person succeed, but not carry the person's responsibilities indefinitely.
Welcome back to Science of Leadership. I'm Tom Collins, and I'm joined again by my friend and co-host, Justin Hamrick. This is part 2 of our conversation on holding people accountable. In part 1, we talked about why accountability is not the same thing as punishment. Accountability is about making the standard real. It starts with clarity before the fact and follow through after the fact. We also talked about why avoiding accountability is not neutral. When a leader walks by a problem, the work does not disappear. The burden usually shifts to someone else, often to the high performers who already carry more than their share of the load. Over time, that damages trust, lowers the real standard, and can quietly erode the whole team. So today, we'll pick up with the harder question. If most leaders know accountability matters, why do so many still avoid it? Why do capable, thoughtful, well-intentioned leaders see a problem, know it needs to be addressed, and still walk by it?
I'm struck by how important this is, how important it is for leaders to get this right. Not only if they do it, but how they do it. So why do so many leaders and organizations avoid these conversations? I think most leaders know, at least in theory, they have to deal with problems. And it's not like they don't recognize it. They'll see some work, something that's done that does not meet their standard. And by their standard, I mean the organization or the team standard that you've set up, but they still don't want to deal with the problem. Why is that?
I think we can name several reasons. Some leaders fear conflict. They feel tension in a relationship and want to get away from it as quickly as possible. Some leaders want to be liked. It's a major issue. They worry that holding somebody accountable will make them seem mean or unsupportive, so they avoid that. Some are afraid of hurting the person. And that's especially common among leaders who genuinely care about their people, but they confuse discomfort with harm. I think some people lack the skill, how to actually go about holding somebody accountable. They've never learned how to be specific or direct and humane at the same time. And some, honestly, are worn down by organizational systems that make consequences difficult. If leaders have tried before and nothing happened, they may start to think, why does this matter? Why even bother? I'm not going to get anywhere because the organizational machine won't let me.
Yeah, that last one's really common. And there has to be some organizational support to hold people accountable. Because like we were talking about at the beginning, if you sort of set up, this is the standard, I notice you're not meeting it, this is how we're going to follow up. If there's no follow-up or no way to improve performance, then the leaders are going to start to feel helpless. They're like, I can say it all I want. I can say I'm motivated, but if the system isn't set up to actually support that, then leaders are just frustrated. They still have all the responsibility, but no authority to clarify the standard, to a coach, to adjust the responsibilities, and when possible, protect their team as much as the authority allows. It would be like a coach who has no authority on the starting lineup. That they're like, listen, this is going to be our standard. We're going to practice hard. We're going to practice like we play. We do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. And they got a player that never shows up for practice, is disruptive in the locker room, and then somebody else sets the starting lineup and puts them on it every week. Like that coach will have no ability to set that standard that they want the team to allow.
Yeah, and leaders can also stop pretending the problem's not there. What they cannot do is complain about the person to everyone else while never talking directly to the person. That is so detrimental.
I think that's probably really common, much more common than people probably know. I think that happens all the times. People complain to the leader about someone else in the organization. The leader agrees, and everyone knows there's a problem, and the person at the center of it never actually hears the truth or hears that feedback. And everybody's like, oh, that's just the way they are. Oh, they're just grumpy. Oh, they're just rude. Oh, they're just lazy. Name some character trait that you want to assign. And for the leader to agree to it, you're agreeing that there's a problem, but then not addressing it with the person and being like, and we're going to follow up on this and get feedback, you're as detrimental to the team and the organization at that point
Absolutely.
as anything.
Yeah. That's one of the worst versions of leadership avoidance. A leader who discusses someone else's shortcomings with everyone except the person who needs to hear it. They're not practicing accountability. They're practicing avoidance. Now, leaders sometimes need to talk with other leaders, sure, get an idea, how might I address this? They may need to go over HR guidance. They may need to understand whether others are seeing the same pattern. That's entirely appropriate. But if those conversations never move beyond that, never become a clear, a direct, a fair conversation with the person who's not meeting the standard, the leader's no longer trying to figure out what's going on. The leader's triangulating. And triangulation in this scenario erodes trust. It breaks down the relationship. And then you can't speak into that person's shortcoming or anybody else's for that matter, because everybody knows how you operate.
Explain a little bit more what you mean about it's not addressing it, it's triangulation. Explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So you got, instead of two parties, you and me, I'm falling short and you need to come talk to me. You're bringing a third person in, right? You're creating this triangle instead of it being dyadic. So that's one form of the word triangulation. Additionally, there's triangulation from getting multiple perspectives so that they all align. And so you're going around talking to everybody else, get their perspective, triangulating on this person without actually talking to them.
I could see how from many perspectives that is not beneficial. Besides, like, okay, I'm just going to gather the information to have a really objective view about this so that I don't bring my own preconceived notions into it, especially if it's somebody that's, you've seen that pattern before. Because people start to think if you're going to talk about that person this way, you're probably talking about me the same way. You have to address it with the person, because the person might hear all this and then come back and be like, why didn't you ever tell me? They may have no idea, no real insight into their own behavior.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's this idea that people say, well, if he's saying that about this person, what's he saying about me? That's exactly what happens. A leader's got to ask what direct conversation needs to happen and who needs to have it. Most of the time, if you're the person's leader, the answer to that question is you. There's another nuance here. Repeated underperformance may reflect a fit problem rather than a motivation problem. The person may not be lazy. They may not be malicious. They may not be trying to hurt the team. They may simply not be capable of succeeding in that role at the needed level.
That seems pretty important because it keeps us from turning every performance problem into a character judgment, which we've talked about before, sort of making that next leap. And it keeps us humane. This is our standard. This is where you're not meeting it. I believe there's nothing innate in your character that is keeping you from it. So this is the path I see forward.
Right. Additionally, it doesn't remove accountability. If someone cannot succeed in the role, leaving them there is not compassionate. It keeps them failing. It keeps the team compensating. It may keep that person from finding a role where they could actually be contributing. And this is something you really have to think about as a leader. When we get to a fit problem, we were talking about, is this a fit issue? You need to do some self-examination. You got to ask yourself, what did I miss when this person was selected or promoted or assigned or retained in this role? Look at what contribution you are having to this problem. Did I overestimate their ability? Did I fail to define the role clearly? Did I ignore early signals? Did I keep hoping the problem would just go away? Fit problems are not only employee problems. They're often leadership learning opportunities. And I think that that's a real issue. I can say I've had situations, in trying to address an issue, one's coming to mind, where I tried multiple times to reset with a person, going in and saying, hey, maybe I wasn't clear at the outset. Here's what our standard is, clarifying that. Providing coaching. I can think of 2 cycles of this, actually, with the same person. Trying to support improvement, and the person still could not perform at the level that the role required. But, and this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, the organizational policies were such that we couldn't remove the person from the organization. That just wasn't a realistic opportunity. And so the practical leadership decision became, where can this person do the least damage? That's not a good outcome. It's not good for the organization. And it's actually not good for the person either. That person might be somewhere else doing something more meaningful and effective. Instead, they're stuck doing work that does not really fit them, while the organization works around what they cannot do. And so weak accountability systems are not compassionate. They can trap people in failure and force everyone else to absorb those consequences. And again, I've had to deal with this, one person in particular, and it has been really challenging, even after going through all the steps of accountability, to be thwarted by the organization. In that scenario, then you have to say, okay, well, again, where can this person do the least damage? Where can they cause the least amount of work for everybody else? And shift into that mode. But anyway, let me pause here for a second and remind our listeners that my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and essentially all online outlets. It's getting rave reviews, and I'm certain you will find it not only informative, but also inspiring. So I hope you'll order your copy today. Now let's get back to this interesting conversation.
We've made a lot of good arguments and logical arguments, I think, about why, from a leader perspective, accountability matters so much. But let's do what we always do on this podcast and bring in the research. What does the science actually say? Does it support the idea that tolerated underperformance, avoidance of feedback, and the creation of an uneven workload on the team actually hurt the people on the team and the people around it?
Yeah, it does. It does, in fact. And the research gives us a useful way to think about something many leaders have seen firsthand. The first study that I can mention by Jung Jin Kim, published in Public Personnel Management, was very valuable. Kim studied what happens when coworkers perceive that poor performers are being mismanaged. And the finding was directly relevant to our conversation. Perceived mismanagement of poor performers increased coworkers' turnover intention. That means they were looking to leave. And that relationship was partly explained by lower effective organizational commitment. In simpler terms, when people believe poor performance is not being handled well, they'll feel less attached to the organization and become more likely to think about leaving. And in this current state, no organization can afford that.
I mean, it sounds like the team is reacting not only to the underperformer, but to the leader's failure to deal with the underperformance. And my guess is the people who are more likely to leave are not the underperformers. Right. They're the high performers dealing with the increased workload because of failure to deal with the accountability issue.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting on a really important thing here. You know, people are not only watching the person who's missing the standard, they're watching whether the leader will protect the standard. And that's really important. A second study by Enigbidian and colleagues in the journal Helion looked at workload balance and job satisfaction. It found that employees' perceptions of workload balance influenced job satisfaction, and that comparison with their colleagues' workloads was part of how employees judge whether the workload felt balanced. And that matters here because tolerated underperformance often creates hidden workload imbalance. The leader may not formally reassign the work, but the work still moves. It still has to get done. And it moves to the dependable person, the conscientious person, the person who will not let the team fail.
So even if nobody says you now have more work because this person isn't doing it, that may be what actually happens in practice. And obviously, the people recognize this. The people know this and notice it.
Yeah, people notice it. And a third study, last study I'll bring up, brings this idea into healthcare. Sung Hui Bei published a 2024 cross-sectional study of nurses in acute care hospitals, and that study found that mandatory overtime was significantly related to intent to leave, and that workload was significantly associated with burnout. Now, that study is not about poor performers. We should not claim that it is, but it does support a related point that matters in healthcare. When people are forced to carry excess work, there are consequences of burnout, consequences of retention. So if we put these together, the lesson's pretty clear. When leaders tolerate persistent underperformance, the cost does not stay isolated. It spreads into workload imbalance, lower job satisfaction, weaker commitment, burnout, and turnover intention.
That makes accountability a team health issue. I mean, not only are you saying that you work harder, you're going to be rewarded with more work, but it also seems to suggest there's some resentment to being held to two different standards. This is the standard I thought we were all being held accountable to. This is the standard I'm living up to, meaning the high performer. And then they're looking, to their left and they're like, but this person is doing less work. They're not meeting the standard. And that's acceptable.
Right. It sows division amongst the team. The team won't perform well in that scenario. So again, accountability in our discussion here is not about being punitive. It's about keeping the commitments of the team real and thinking about more than just that one person who's underperforming.
It seems like the science backs up what we have logically discussed at the beginning, which is extremely detrimental to teams to avoid accountability. It doesn't seem to really go to, well, a leader routinely doesn't recognize it. I mean, recognition doesn't seem to be the majority of one of the failures. The failure seems to be avoidance. So let's get to where we always like to get to in the end. So what? Let's make this practical. You're a leader listening to this in the organization, and you realize, I have someone who is not meeting the standard. It seems obvious that the first step is not to march into the room full of your entire team and to dump this frustration. But how do you actually do it practically? Are you sending a text message? Are you sending an email? Like, what are you doing? Like, how do you do this correctly? Because doing it incorrectly can be almost as detrimental as avoidance.
Yeah, I think the first step, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is a self-check. The leader's got to stop and say, okay, I need to answer some questions here first. What standard was missed? Did I make that standard clear? What specific behavior or outcome is the problem? What support have I offered this person to improve? What's the appropriate next step if nothing changes? If I can't answer those questions, I probably need to spend more time preparing for the conversation.
I think that is really, really important, because to just go in there and trying to address a single issue instead of trying to get back to, like you said, where was the standard missed? And did I, as a leader at organization, make that standard extremely clear? Or am I trying to impose an unwritten work ethic on someone? If you weren't clear about the standard, it's very difficult to hold someone to it. I can't expect my child to take out the trash every day if I didn't make it clear that that was one of their responsibilities. And if you can't answer those, 100% agree, you need to spend time on the front end, making it extremely clear in your own mind how you're going to answer those in the conversation. They all should probably be answered in the conversation. Even if you haven't had to address it before, maybe the answer isn't, well, what have I done to help you? But how am I going to help you going forward?
Yeah, absolutely.
Those questions seem useful because it keeps the leader from being vague and relying on some character flaw. Like, those 5 questions seem to clearly address an issue, whereas going to a character flaw of you're lazy, you're talking about being vague and not really addressing anything. Oh, or you're just lazy. Oh, you're just not a good worker. Oh, any of those things really, how is the low performer, underperformer supposed to leave that? They're like, well, what am I supposed to do next? Like, what am I to address so that when we follow up, I actually know what I'm going to be measured against?
Yeah. Vagueness is an enemy of accountability. When leaders are vague, they say things like, hey, you need to step up. You need to be more professional. You need to be a better team player. And that may be true, but that's not very clear. A person can't look at something and go, okay, this is exactly what I need to be doing. Somebody needs to know what is happening, what standards being missed, why it matters, what they need to do to change, to improve, to prevent that vagueness. I can give you 5 steps for holding people accountable. Step number 1, clarify or reset the standard. Your first move should be clarification. If the standard was not clear, the leader has to own that. Conversation might sound like, hey, I realize I've not been as clear as I should have been about what success looks like here. Let me reset the expectation. Then make that expectation concrete. Going forward, I need this report completed by noon every Friday with the data checked before it comes to me. If there's a barrier, I need to know by Thursday afternoon, not after the deadline. That is accountability before the fact. That's making it clear. This is what is expected.
That feels very different from coming in after the fact and saying, you're not doing what you need to. You keep disappointing me.
Yeah.
Like, that sort of expectation of this is what I expect seems very clear. You didn't meet that.
Yeah, it is. It's very different. It gives the person a fair chance to meet the expectation. Mm-hmm. Again, that does not apply the same way to clear ethical or professional violations. Step 2, address the gap early. Once the standard is clear, the leader has to follow up. If the gap appears again, address it early. The conversation might sound like this. I want to talk with you about this gap between what we agreed to and what's happening. My goal is not to punish you. My goal is to get clear about what is getting in the way and help you meet the standard. Then be specific. We agreed that the report would be completed by noon on Friday. The last 2 weeks, it came in late. In both cases, that delayed other people's work. Then you can ask, help me understand what is getting in the way.
That question is really important because you're assuming you don't know everything that's going on. You don't know your blind spots. There may be something that's happening, some other thing that is impairing them to actually do it. And at least then you make them relook at it. Like, okay, why am I not meeting this? Is this an unreal standard that's set? Do I not believe in the standard? Do I not think it matters? You can really get some good input from the person getting the feedback of how they see the problem. And many times their proposed solution to it.
Yeah, I would say often there's something the leader doesn't know. And accountability does not require the leader assume the worst. There may be a workload issue, a training issue, a resource issue, personal issue, a fit issue, but you'll not know if you avoid the conversation. And here's where timing matters. When you see a problem, again, address it. Do not wait until you are furious. Do not wait until the team is resentful. Do not wait until the pattern is entrenched. Never walk by a problem. Step 3, coach toward the standard. If the gap continues, the next move is coaching. That might sound like this. We're still not consistently meeting the expectation. Let's work through what would help you meet it. This is where the leader may offer training, a checklist, clearer workflow, more frequent check-ins, mentorship, or a change in how the work is organized. But there's a line leaders have to watch. There's a difference between supporting and rescuing. Support means I help you meet the standard. Rescuing means I absorb the consequences when you do not. Support is leadership. Rescuing, when it continues too long, becomes avoidance with extra steps.
The work's got to go somewhere. And if you're absorbing it or you're putting Band-Aids over this, eventually it's becoming too much of a problem. So the leader should help the person succeed, but not carry the person's responsibilities indefinitely. That is not addressing the problem.
Right. A leader owns clarity, support, fairness, and follow through, but the person still owns whether they meet the standard. If someone's given the standard, coached toward it, provided reasonable support, told the consequences, and still cannot or will not get it done, that's not on the leader. That's on the person. Step 4, name the consequence. At some point, if that gap persists, you got to name what happens next. It doesn't have to be cruel, but it does have to be clear. For example, if we cannot get this to the needed level, we will need to consider whether this is the right role or arrangement for you. Or if this pattern continues, I will need to change how this responsibility is assigned. Another option might be, if we do not see sustained improvement, we will need to move into a more formal performance process. The key is that the person should not be surprised later.
Yeah. So it should be progressive, not avoidance, followed by an explosion. Like you said, you just avoid until you're resentful or furious, or you've heard so much about it or talked so much about it with other team members and not them, that you're sort of exploding to someone who never saw this coming.
Yeah, progression. That's a good way to say it. Accountability should move from clarity to coaching to consequences to action. What happens too often is avoidance, resentment, explosion. That's just bad leadership. Finally, step 5, follow through. The final step of follow through. If you say there's going to be a consequence, this gets back to you talking about parenting earlier, and nothing happens, you teach the person and the team that the standard is not real. Follow through might mean changing responsibilities. It might mean formal performance management. It might mean reassignment. It might mean deciding that this role is not the right fit. A conversation at that stage might sound like this. Hey, look, we've worked on this together. We clarified the expectation, put support in place, followed up several times, but the gap remains. We need to make a change. That's hard. That's the thing that people are afraid of doing, I think, when they're avoiding. But sometimes it's the right thing to do.
You really need organizational support for a lot of this. Like you've got to have the ability to do. Where does documentation fit into this? Because that can sound like you're building a case, but also you want to have very clear expectations.
Yeah, you're right. Documentation can sound like you're building a case against somebody, but it doesn't have to be punitive. Good documentation protects clarity. After a serious accountability conversation, write down what was discussed and share that with the person. My approach is, we have the conversation, immediately write an email that contains, this was my perspective on our conversation. Here are the action items. Here are the, deadlines, et cetera, and you share that with them. You're documenting it, but you're documenting it in such a way that is designed to be helpful to that person. What was the standard that we clarified? What was the gap that we named? What support was offered? What did that person agree to? You said that you would do X. And when will you follow up? What happens if that gap persists? That protects both people from lying on memory later. And if the pattern continues, that documentation then helps show that the process was clear, fair, and progressive.
So we've talked a little bit about how these conversations should go, but the team, to know you're addressing it, needs to have some knowledge of all this. But we don't want to condemn in public, not at a meeting of the whole thing, but how public should accountability be, knowing that the standard wasn't met? Because most of us have heard, you praise in public, but correct in private. But your team does need to know that you're protecting them. So how do we do this? How do we do this right?
Yeah, I agree that you want to praise in public, correct in private as a general rule. You don't want to humiliate people. That will get you nowhere from a leadership standpoint. Okay. And that's not really leadership. That's something else, I think. But you don't want to humiliate people. But you don't want accountability to go unrecognized.
Mm-hmm.
You want people in your team to understand. You don't have to make a public example of someone unless the situation is so public or so serious that it requires a broader response. Hey, look, Justin was stealing money from us and he's fired, but you make the culture of accountability public. The team doesn't need to know the details of somebody's performance problem. They don't need to know the gossip. They don't need to have private personnel information. What they need to know is that leaders are paying attention, that standards matter, that problems are being addressed. You might say, look, I know there have been concerns about workload and follow through, and I want you to know we're addressing those issues directly. My expectation is that everyone performs at the level needed and that we do not shift burdens onto the people who are already carrying the work. That doesn't shame anybody, but it lets the team know that the leader is not walking by a problem. One quick guardrail on this: accountability is not perfectionism. Leaders should not use standards as a cover for nitpicking, controlling people, or creating fear. The question is not, did this person make a mistake? The question is there a meaningful gap between the commitments of the role and what is actually happening? Good teams need grace. They need learning. They need room for honest mistakes. They also need standards. Let me give leaders a practical sequence they can adapt. If the standard was unclear, say something like, I realize I may not have been clear enough about what success looks like here. Let me reset the expectation. If the standard was clear, but the gap continues, hey, we talked about this expectation. I'm still seeing a gap. Here's what I'm noticing specifically. Help me understand what's getting in the way. If coaching is needed, how about let's identify what would help you meet this consistently. Here's the support I can offer. Here's what I need to see. Let's agree on when we will revisit this. And then if consequences need to be named, if we cannot get this to the level that's needed, we'll need to look at other alternatives. That may include changing responsibilities, changing the role, or moving into a more formal process. And again, if that gap still remains, hey, look, we've worked on this, gap still remains. At this point, we need to make a change. The tone matters. It shouldn't be delivered with contempt. It should be delivered with seriousness and care. One of the most important sentences a leader can say is, I care about you and I care about what we are doing here. For that reason, I need to be honest with you about what has to improve. That's accountability of standards delivered through care. Justin, got one final question for you. For the leader listening who knows there's an accountability conversation they've been avoiding, what would you want them to do this week?
The biggest is going to be taking action and being very intentional about the action. I think there's a lot of ways to convince yourself that you're addressing things when you're not really addressing them. As I'm going through listening to sort of your 5 steps, this does not seem to me to be something that happens in an email or a text message. My guess is that this is an in-person, face-to-face, not on Zoom conversation.
Right. Absolutely required in person.
And I would say, if you've got something, if you find yourself saying someone's lazy or saying something about someone's character, stop yourself from saying it and be like, what gap am I seeing, if there's one, and how am I going to address it? And set up a meeting in person with the individual. That's, it's sort of like going to the gym. If you bring your shoes and bring your gym bag, you've already started. You've already made one. And sort of setting up a meeting, you're already starting to do that.
Yeah, I would say, think of one problem you've been walking by. One standard that has not been clear, one performance gap you've tolerated, one behavior you've complained about to others but not addressed directly, one high performer who's carrying the burden because you have not dealt with the issue. This week, don't try to solve everything. Just begin. Clarify the standard. Name the shortcoming. Have that conversation in person. Offer support. Set the follow-up. Care enough to hold the standard. Remember, avoiding accountability is a leadership failure. But accountability is also a leadership skill. You can learn it, you can practice it, you can get better at it. And when you do, you serve the person, the team, and the mission.